Welcome everyone to the second of two expert voices that we are hosting, looking at the lessons and learnings from the private law Pathfinder evaluation. So my name is Vicky Mulligan. I'm the interim director of the centre and I have the pleasure of chairing today's event. Last week we focused on the Pathfinder pilot process evaluation. That was a mouthful. So last week we focused on the Pathfinder pilot process evaluation, which was published last year, and that was looking at the recommendations and hearing from colleagues about the learning that has been taken away and implemented 1 year on. I'm not going to speak too much to the aims of the pilot. I encourage you to watch last week's session to understand these in more detail, but I will set the scene by saying that the Pathfinder pilot was designed in response to recommendations from the Harm Panel report to reform the private law process and improve families' experiences of that process by trialling a more problem-solving, investigative approach. Pathfinder was initially launched in North Wales and Dorset in 2022, and it has since been established in 8 more DFJ areas across England and across the whole of Wales. So today's event will focus on the research that's been completed in the second part of the research and the evaluation of Pathfinder, and that was focused on understanding the experiences of children and families that have gone through the Pathfinder approach, and that evaluation was published in January this year. So we are delighted today to be joined by Dr. Charlotte Barlow, Dr. Claire Scully and Dr. Helen Richardson-Foster to discuss this research and share its findings. Charlotte is an associate professor in criminology and criminal justice at the University of Leeds, and she's the vice president of the British Society of Criminology. Charlotte has led or co-led various research projects on gender-based violence with a particular emphasis on criminal and family justice responses to domestic abuse. And we're also joined by Claire, who's a research associate at the University of Manchester and an experienced researcher who's contributed to multi-interdisciplinary projects on trauma-informed practice and violence reduction. And Helen is a senior research fellow in the Connect Centre at the University of Lancashire, and she's worked as a researcher in universities and the voluntary sector for over 25 years. Her research interests include domestic abuse, child protection and family support. So we'll hear first from our researchers, and then after that I'll introduce you to Teresa Levy, who we are really pleased to be joined to have joined us today as well. Teresa is the Director of Transformation at CAFCAS, and we're also very fortunate to have reflections that are being shared via video from Anna Sinclair, who is the Head of Practice for CAFCAS Cymru. And then last but absolutely not least, we are grateful to also be joined by Dr. Alicia Ibrahimi, who is the Senior Policy Advisor and Family Justice Lead to the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. And Alicia will outline the Commissioner's gold standard for family court proceedings, emphasising what should be happening in the courts to be survivor-centric. So thank you all for joining today. I am now going to hand over to Charlotte, Claire and Helen to speak to the research.
Thank you, Vicky, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So yes, I don't need to do the introductions, which has given us back some time, but it's just to say that as you'll see from that slide there were a variety of other colleagues that supported with this strand of the evaluation who are all listed on the slide there. So just to extend sincere thanks to everybody that was involved in this evaluation. Next slide, please. And Vicky has also helpfully contextualized the sort of introduction of the Pathfinder courts. So I will just sort of highlight very briefly here that the sort of introduction of the Pathfinder courts pilots from 2022 onwards really had a number of sort of core aims, which were centered on improving the family court experience for all parties, particularly parent and child victim survivors of domestic abuse, delivering a more efficient service, and also reducing re-traumatisation for victims of domestic abuse, reducing the number of returning cases, and adopting a multi-agency approach to improve coordination. So those were the sort of key chief aims of the implemented Pathfinder approach. Next slide, please, Miranda. I'm not going to talk to this in any great detail because for those that were at the webinar last week, we sort of went through in a little bit of detail the differences between the Pathfinder approach and the CAP. But just for those of you that weren't there, the sort of central approach to the Pathfinder model is an application is made to court. That's then checked for safeguarding issues. Once that's done, it's passed to the information assessment and early information gathering stage, which is where key agencies work together to complete the child impact report. And it's at that point where domestic abuse may be identified and risk assessments completed. A judge then reviews the child impact report, decides what to do next. And once the court has all the information it needs to make a decision, a final order is then made in line with the child's best interest. And then it may be that some cases are subject to a review stage a number of months afterwards. So that's the sort of key sort of process that the Pathfinder model takes. Next slide, please. So, as Vicky's mentioned, last week we spent some time talking about the process evaluation, which involved seeking the views of professionals at both pilot sites on their views on how Pathfinder was working. Then we, after this stage of the evaluation, we then moved on to stage or phase 2, which was focused on exploring the views of children, parents and families who had been through the Pathfinder process, and it's that we're going to be talking about today. So the evaluation basically wanted to understand the lived experience of parents and children who'd been through that Pathfinder process and to explore how those experiences sort of mapped on to the Pathfinder policy goals. So to do this, we conducted semi-structured interviews with parents, carers and children across both Dorset and North Wales. So parents and children were given a choice whether or not interviews took place online or in person, with interviews with younger children in particular taking place in person. So we interviewed 39 parents across both sites and 9 children. And although we recognise the limits of this data, so it was from a small sample of families and reflecting the experiences of those who participated, actually the aim of this research was never about establishing prevalence, but it was rather to understand in an in-depth manner the lived experiences of those who had been through the Pathfinder process. And similarly, the recruitment of children was a challenge at both sites, mostly because the parents were understandably reluctant to provide consent for children to take part in a research about a very traumatic time in families' lives. And there was also children who had additional needs and so on, and parents were worried about participation from that front in case the interview was too overwhelming. But despite these sorts of challenges, the children's interviews and also the parents' interviews yielded some really valuable and in-depth insights into the experiences of families who had been through the Pathfinder process, and we're incredibly grateful for their time. So at this point, I'll pass over to Claire now, who's going to begin talking through a bit of a headline of the key findings from the project. So thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Charlotte. So we're going to now go through a few of our key findings, kind of comparing children's and parents' experiences with those Pathfinder policy goals that Charlotte laid out just before. But before we go into the findings themselves, I just want to make a brief comment about, I guess, the overall tone of the interviews. So for most people, you know, going through a separation and through the family court process is not a pleasant experience. So we didn't expect people to kind of talk about it in glowing terms or reflect on how much they would really love to do it again. As one of the mothers that we spoke to put it, I suppose it's not really something that you can take lots of positives from as an experience. It's something that you don't want to do, but you just have to do it. So our focus was more on kind of exploring what had worked well and not so well for families within that difficult context. And we also wanted to understand what changes people had noticed under Pathfinder if they had been through the CAP process before. Next slide, please, Miranda. So as Charlotte said, the first goal of Pathfinder was to improve the family court experience for all parties, and in particular for victim survivors of domestic abuse. I'll be discussing domestic abuse a little bit later on, so for now I'm just going to kind of focus on people's experiences with all of those different agencies involved in the court process. So most families we spoke to had interactions with Cafcass or Cafcass Cymru Family Court Advisors, or FCAs, as part of their cases. And the children really described feeling comfortable, listened to, and understood while they were speaking with those FCAs. Most of them were given a choice about whether they wanted to speak to an FCA, and some were really pleased to have had the chance to be heard as part of that court process, as the first quote there shows. Mothers also tended to have quite positive experiences with FCAs, so they described them as being attentive and fair, and they felt like their children had been spoken to in quite a kind of constructive, sensitive, tactful manner. Fathers, on the other hand, tended to be slightly more negative about FCAs, kind of reporting that their contact had been fairly minimal or poor. And they also said that their points of view had been overlooked by FCAs who were more kind of biased towards mothers. Fewer people had interactions with local authorities, but of those who did, most described negative experiences and said that their children's views were either not captured or misrepresented by social workers, as the second quote there from the child shows. Some participants had positive experiences with individual workers, which suggested to us that sort of trust had been built over time. But there was a lot of staff turnover, which meant that that trust had to kind of be built and rebuilt as new workers came on the scene. Looking at the court side of things, adult participants' interactions with judges varied. So they had positive experiences where they felt believed and listened to, and they described this as being really empowering. Having said that, many mothers told us that judges were dismissive of their experiences. Fathers' reports were more mixed, so some said that judges were quite fair and understanding, whereas others said sort of the opposite. In terms of other court staff, parents at both sites described feeling really well informed early in the process, and that was mostly because they received a kind of general information leaflet that gave them a really good overview of the process and a helpline number for further support. But overall, people tended also to report poorer experiences both with Cafcass and Cafcass Cymru, local authorities and the courts when their cases involved domestic abuse. So next slide, please, Miranda. So another goal of Pathfinder was to improve the experiences and reduce the re-traumatization of domestic abuse victim survivors. And most of the people that we spoke to had domestic abuse in their cases, so this was discussed a lot. There were some positive developments under Pathfinder, but there was also a general feeling that there was a lack of understanding of domestic abuse and trauma-informed practice. So although there had been some progress towards this goal, there were still some opportunities for improvement. One of the things that came up a lot was mediation. So parents whose cases involved domestic abuse tended not to be offered mediation under Pathfinder. Those who had been through CAP before said that mediation had been offered to them then, even when their cases involved domestic abuse. So not being offered mediation under Pathfinder was seen as a positive change. On a less positive note, though, some mothers and fathers felt that Cafcass or Cafcass Cymru and local authorities didn't take their allegations of domestic abuse seriously. So some mothers from both sites felt that FCAs didn't believe or hear them, and a few noted that although they'd reported or discussed domestic abuse, that hadn't then been included in the child impact report, as the quote on the slide there shows. Some fathers also felt like their allegations of domestic abuse weren't taken as seriously as they would have been if a woman had made them. That wasn't true across all parents, though, and a few mothers and fathers did share positive experiences with us. In terms of the interactions with judges and magistrates, a few mothers said that domestic abuse had been handled well in their cases and they felt really believed and validated. In general, though, both mothers and fathers reported largely negative experiences when it came to domestic abuse. Mothers sort of described judges as being insensitive and not trauma-informed, as the second quote on the slide there shows. And on the other hand, fathers said that judges didn't really do enough to challenge accusations that were made against them. Coming back to the positives, the direct involvement of domestic abuse services in Pathfinder was seen as a major improvement. Most people had really good interactions with those services and were pleased with the kind of emotional and practical support they provided, which included things like, workers going to court hearings along with participants, helping them to access legal aid and special measures. Next slide, please, Miranda. So Pathfinder introduced a few new practices to better support domestic abuse victim survivors. And one of these was completing a DASH, which is a domestic abuse, stalking and honour-based violence risk assessment. And a few parents who had been through CAP before said a risk assessment hadn't been offered to them then, but one had been under Pathfinder, and that was seen as quite a positive change. However, there were some people who experienced domestic abuse who said a DASH hadn't been completed or offered to them as part of their case. So overall, the inclusion of the DASH was seen as a positive, but it wasn't always done. It was similar for special measures, which were also offered to those who had experienced domestic abuse most of the time. So mothers who'd gone through CAP before said that special measures were more available to them under Pathfinder than they had been under CAP. And those who used special measures generally found them quite reassuring, especially when they had sort of anxiety or physical symptoms at the thought of seeing their perpetrator again. And as that second quote shows, it was a problem, though, when those special measures were offered and either not implemented at all or not implemented to the full extent promised, which did happen to some of our participants. And some also said that professionals had queried why special measures were even needed in their cases, which was quite upsetting for them. And a few didn't even remember being offered special measures at all. Next slide, please, Miranda. So people whose cases involved domestic abuse also talked a lot about counter allegations and re-traumatization. Mothers who'd been through CAP before felt like counter allegations were dealt with more effectively under Pathfinder. Most mothers describe positive experiences in terms of how counter allegations were dealt with, and they appreciated it when the professionals didn't uphold them. This wasn't the case for all mothers, though, and some said that professionals tended to see their cases more as being like parental conflict and didn't really think about, the harms of not investigating counter allegations. Some fathers also said that they regretted bringing up domestic abuse or making counter allegations in their cases. Mothers were the only ones who described re-traumatization from court proceedings. So a number of fathers said that the court process was stressful, but they didn't kind of use that language or labeling of re-traumatization. Mothers found a few things to be particularly re-traumatizing, including being in the same room as the perpetrator, especially when they hadn't seen them for quite a long period of time, and also having courts doubt their allegations of abuse. In some cases, these experiences exacerbated existing post-traumatic stress disorders. Mothers told us that being believed and listened to in court would have improved their experiences and reduced their re-traumatization a lot. So overall, there was sort of a general feeling that court proceedings weren't trauma-informed, as some of the quotes here show. And this was one of the kind of really key recommendations of the report that led to the development of these Pathfinder courts. So kind of what told us said that there's still some way to go in towards achieving that from their perspective. I'll now hand you over to Helen, who'll talk you through the rest of our findings on the next slide.
Super. Thanks, Claire. So moving on to children's experience and participation in Pathfinder. This is perhaps the goal that was best achieved, with children saying that they felt that they did have a chance to have a say in proceedings. And most of the children that we spoke to and their parents said that FCAs and social workers had put children at ease and given them choice about where to meet. As we mentioned, a lot of the interactions children had with Cafcass or Cafcass Cymru workers or local authority social workers were at school, and being given that choice of where to meet in a safe, neutral place was valued. Children also described feeling anxious and nervous beforehand, and that workers have been able to put them at ease. But some children did mention that they would have liked some more information and some more interactions with professionals, and that they particularly found it challenging when they were left unsure about what the court's decision would be or what might happen next, as that last quote on the left says. When it comes to taking children's views into account, most children were pleased to have been given a voice in proceedings, and parents said that they felt children's views had been sought and incorporated. However, there were mixed opinions as to whether this was actually considered during proceedings, and this really, listening to children really is vital to elevating children's mental health and well-being. And you can see that quote in the middle from the child saying he really wanted the chance to speak, and even though it was hard. And then the third part, critical to children's experience and participation, is the child impact report. And this was seen by parents and children as a really useful opportunity for their views and wishes to be incorporated into the process, their views about contact and living arrangements. And there were positive comparisons for parents here who had been through the CAP process previously. Receiving a copy of the report in advance was really important, so parents could reflect on their experiences and prepare for court, and it gave some of them reassurance. However, some parents did say that they hadn't received the report prior to the hearing or couldn't recall seeing it. So you can see the quote there from the child about that. So generally, parents felt, comfortable sharing their views and that this was a positive part of the process. Next slide, please. Thinking about multi-agency working, there were some points here that we felt that parents noted that information being shared between agencies, and particularly about safeguarding and welfare concerns, was something that needed addressing. So some parents reported that safeguarding concerns had been managed well, but there was some experiences of parents where they felt that their welfare issues, safeguarding concerns about their children had either been downplayed or ignored by multiple agencies. And this was understandably frustrating for parents, and particularly when this hadn't been included in the child impact report. And you can see the quote there from the mother who had raised concerns to the Early Help Hub and felt that this wasn't considered in the child impact report and in the process. And sort of linked to that, for some parents where issues had not been resolved and their case was concluded, there was a lack of clarity about what would happen and what support would be available if issues arose again. And this suggests that some of the challenges in achieving the harm panel report objective of adopting a safety-focused and investigative approach to managing safeguarding concerns is, still going some way to not being addressed. So if we just move on to the next slide, please, Miranda, about the efficiency of the court process. So again, being able to speak to parents who'd had experience of CAP, the interviews that we did with those parents and families, they could tell us that the Pathfinder process did feel quicker, more efficient, and there were clear positive differences in the court process for them. Whilst the process could still be lengthy and cause anxiety and stress, this was felt by parents to be at least quicker than previously. Children told us that they could find the delays something stressful and scary, and that quote there sort of describes that child's experience about how the length and the wait really impacted on their anxiety and stress. But compared to CAP, it was speedier. And there was an interesting finding from some mothers whose cases involved domestic abuse that they shared they had concerns about the speed of court processes. Sometimes things could feel slightly rushed. Mothers saying that they maybe didn't have the opportunity to fully share their experiences of domestic abuse in court, and they felt that there was perhaps more of an emphasis on the quick progression of the case. But these mothers did say that they felt their experiences had been captured in the child impact report. Next slide, please, Miranda. And so just thinking about returning cases, this is something that we mentioned in our presentation last week, but there was some progression around this goal of thinking about cases coming back into the courts and about the review stage. So generally, parents felt that court orders were sustainable when they got the outcomes that they wanted. And most children felt happy with the outcomes of their case. But where parents hadn't got an outcome that they wanted or didn't feel that the what had been put in place was achievable, that's when they were struggling. Mothers in particular stated that ex-partners not keeping to arrangements, not communicating or engaging in abusive or challenging behaviour made things difficult. Some mothers said that the court order wasn't working, and there were also mothers talked to us about receiving inappropriate referrals as a result of being through Pathfinder, for example, being referred to parenting courses. So you can see that quote there from that mum. And then, as I mentioned, the review stage is something that was part of Pathfinder at the pilot stage. And across both sites, most parents that we spoke to had not had a review or follow-up for their case after the final order, and despite some of them being told that this would happen. And parents that we spoke to when we mentioned this did say that they feel they could have benefited from a check-in or a follow-up or some additional support. Particularly those where there was domestic abuse in their case. And that you can see an example there from mum in North Wales saying she didn't know how to manage it and wasn't sure where to go next. Okay, over to you, Charlotte.
I will just sort of spend one more minute, which I think we have, sort of bringing all of this together. But I know that we've got we have a lot to get through there. But just to kind of highlight really some of the key takeaways that we think for policy and practice from this stage of the evaluation. Firstly, maintaining the focus on the child. So in particular, really positive progress being made here, but making sure that how children's voices are heard it should be kept under review. Making sure there is continued emphasis on reducing re-traumatisation for victim survivors of domestic abuse. So further improvements here are needed and considerations needed here in terms of any further rollout. So in particular, in terms of managing the dynamics of domestic abuse, fully investigating, believing and hearing victim survivors, and ensuring those trauma-informed gendered understandings of domestic abuse are key. Relatedly, implementing special measures as promised being important, as well as the continued importance of including domestic abuse services as they were seen as integral to the Pathfinder model from the perspective of victim survivors. Continued emphasis on multi-agency working, so ensuring that shared understanding of safeguarding welfare issues and domestic abuse concerns. Balancing the length of the process, so committing to efficiencies whilst also balancing the need with allowing families to have their voices heard in court. We mentioned last week about reconsidering the review stage and thinking about how that's communicated with families, but we do still feel that the inclusion of this stage for victim survivors of domestic abuse is important and should be prioritised. And also continuing to improve understandings of the harms of alienating behaviour, so ensuring that children are spoken with and that professionals are fully able to navigate the complexities of that. Final slide, please, Miranda. So basically, the evaluation highlights that from the perspectives of children and families, there are certainly some key overall benefits that are achieved through Pathfinder. So in particular, including and recognising children's experiences and voices, improvements in interacting with some key agencies and professionals, that earlier information sharing and earlier resolution of cases was largely viewed favourably. There are still challenges that remain, in particular persistent issues with trauma-informed understandings of domestic abuse and potentially some negative interactions with professionals if domestic abuse is present in a case, with those persistent challenges with multi-agency working and the review stage in particular also being notable. So there has been significant improvements in the experience of families in under the Pathfinder process, but there is still more work to do and more learning to be taken for the pilot sites, but also other areas that are looking to roll out as well. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Charlotte, Claire and Helen, thank you so much. That was, I mean, an incredibly complex amount of information to get across in what we've given you quite a short period of time as well. So I really appreciate that. And I think it's I mean, my head's kind of swimming with lots of thoughts as well. So I really encourage people to use the Q&A. Please do ask questions. I can see that there's a couple that have gone in there, but please do use that. And thank you for kind of presenting the overview of what some of the positives are, but also where there are challenges and there's kind of more thinking that's needed as well. And like you say, there's lots that sounds very familiar, but also there's lots that's really new and rich from that in terms of being able for you to speak, albeit a small sample, but to have spoken directly with those parents and grandparents and children that are going through that process to see how they are experiencing it. So thank you very much for that. So yes, I know we've got questions there at the minute, but please do put those in the Q&A. And we are going to hand straight over to Teresa, who I had mentioned before is the Director of Transformation at CAFCAS for England.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I hope that's working. Yep, great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, colleagues, for your presentation. It was really helpful just to kind of remind myself again of the outcomes from that, and very much in line with so much of what we see in CAFCAS and that kind of complexity, I suppose, around really understanding that. First of all, I suppose I wanted to say that the Pathfinder courts or the Pathfinder process isn't a panacea. You know, I think we have to be really careful always to sort of remind ourselves that no one thing is going to give us the outcomes we're looking for, other than, you know, huge culture change that pays good attention to the needs of children first and victims too, in that victim-centric way. So, but it is an enabler, and it's a really important enabler, I think, for the hope that we want to maintain and keep live in the whole of the system about delivering a better experience for children, young people and their families at a time of great turmoil. And of course, we're only here because of the children. Grown-ups can do their thing. But once children are in the middle of that, none of us want children to be living their lives in the family law courts. That's just not a good place to be for a long period of time. And so that element of Pathfinder, which allows us to really keep at the heart that sense of doing better, ever better for children and their carers. Your next slide, thank you. There we are. So just a quick reminder, because there is, as I've discovered, I've only been in CAFCAS now for about 10 months and really kind of learning that there's a lot of confusion around CAFCAS role, and that's not surprising because it's a very particular position. But our duty is absolutely to safeguard and promote the welfare of children going through the family justice system, but we're not a statutory investigation organisation. If we identify risk and harm, we must and do pass that on to local authorities and then work closely with them. And of course, we're representing their views and their interests in the family court proceedings, and our family court advisors advise that court in terms of what is safe for those children and in their best interests. And those recommendations are an area where we continue to really focus upon to make sure that those recommendations pick up all of those issues, especially those where there's risk and harm and children as victims in their own right, where domestic abuse is a factor in that family. We're focusing on those children's needs, and we're focusing on assessing that risk and harm. And most importantly, looking to always amplify children's voices. You know, it's just so telling for all of us. We know how difficult it is in the noise and the creation of noise in a place like a family law environment for children's voices to be heard. And so our job is absolutely to amplify that. With over 140,000 children each year, that's a fantastic the high number of children who CAFCAS are involved in, and 2/3 of those are in private family law. And that means that we work ever harder to make sure that those kind of feedback messages you've already heard from the research around, most children, thankfully, told the research that actually they felt their voices were able to be heard and they were able to communicate. And it's hugely important for us, but we know we've got more to do. Next slide, please. So just a very brief summary for those of you who have got all the kind of detail around what we're moving from and what we're moving to. And of course, we're waiting for complete determination around how far Pathfinder will go across the country, but we know we're still rolling out further again this year. But at the present time, it's a little less than 20% of our work in private law is in the Pathfinder space. So therefore, 80% of it is still in the CAP. And therefore, it's important for people to, and this is a difficult time for us to determine the change, because actually families are often having both experiences still across the country. And we're really thoughtful about that, how we make sure that where the CAP continues for however long it continues, and wherever it continues, it is also benefiting from all of the training and learning and improvement, really, that we're doing across the whole piece that is also being driven by Pathfinder. Where we have Pathfinder, that means there's no safeguarding letters. And, I think it was news to a lot of people when they first began to look at this piece that back in the CAP process, and so remembering that's still live for lots of parts of the country, we're not allowed to see children. We don't see children in that space. This is an assessment done without ever seeing a child. And that will disappear under Pathfinder, as will Section 7 reports, as will HEDRAs. And we have this new information screening phase. I heard it described earlier in the presentation as being a place where we might first identify domestic abuse. And that's right. That might be the place where we first look at the risk and harm for the child, because that's the place where we're hearing from police and local authority colleagues. And obviously within that local authority information in particular, we might also have some information from health colleagues and others in terms of how those children's lives are running through at the moment and what's happening in that family for them. And we've got a very short period of time within that, 7 working days, to really get that information screening right. And that gives a bit of a clue. And, we've already heard about the challenge, really, I think, about what is the right pace? What is the right pace for work to be done in the family law space for children? And is that the same pace as it is for the adults? And is that the same pace as it is for victims? And I think those remain really important debates for us to be having as we go forward. And we are progressing that ever more quickly, rapidly, as those child impact reports are completed and filed within 40 working days, and the decision hearing that then happens. And I think, as I introduced at the beginning, I don't think any of us would want our children to be living out their lives in the family law courts. But we know under CAP at the present time, it's not wholly unusual for children to be within that framework for the best part of 2 years of their life. And whilst lots of that is system-wide challenge, the reality is if you're 4 and you're exiting that process when you're 6, or if you're 6 and you're exiting when you're 8, that's a significant amount of time when you've not been sure about what's happening in your world, and that's not okay for us. And at CAFCAS, we are relentless about looking to drive out any delay that we can in CAP or Pathfinder, whilst going at the right pace for the child, for victims, and for families more widely. But we do need to really appreciate that if we stay child focused, we have to ask ourselves, how is it for a child to grow? How is it for their mental health when they don't know where they are in their life environment for the next month, 6 months, 12 months, 2 years? Next slide, please. So what children are telling us about Pathfinder, which is working well, and we want to do much more of this, but we do get some great feedback in terms of amount from children and positivity too, but we look for it all. So you can see some of the things there that children have been saying, and it's very much in line with what we've been hearing from the research. Next slide, please. And parents and carers too. We know that there's a lot of positivity coming back from the way in which Pathfinder is experienced by parents and carers, and of course within that the work of the IDVA services too. And we want to see even more timely, and for us obviously in Pathfinder that means some quite rapid involvement with IDVAs into the space with those women in particular, as is usually the case. But lots of feedback there in terms of how families are experiencing Pathfinder in a much more positive way. Thank you. Next slide, please. Where we need to do even more. So it's interesting, the timeliness of proceedings remains, as I've said, I think a real debate point for us as a system to be thinking about just how quickly is the right pace. I think we all know that we want to get resolution. I mean, it takes no working out that by the time a family have got into the family law environment, there's already been a long period of dispute. So actually the clock might start ticking for us in terms of all of our performance frameworks from the point in which the first hearing or the first application. But the reality is for that little person, for that young person, it's going to have been a lot longer than that. And that level of challenge for them, we have to keep an absolute focus on making sure that we can resolve these matters effectively and hopefully once and for all in a timely way. And that remains a challenge for us, and we have to do more. Multi-agency working, so we don't work alone. Clearly we work with the whole system, and many of the cultures of those systems are not always converging. And that is a real work of art for us going forward, to be thinking with our judiciary colleagues, with our local authority colleagues, who actually, although I noticed in the research there wasn't a lot of engagement with necessarily, we are seeing increased levels of engagement in private family law. And with a range of other colleagues, clearly, in terms of that place and the IDVAs in particular, around how we all work together to make sure that this programme can truly deliver the improvements that I think it has got the hopeful optimism in order to be able to do. And one of those improvements has to be about improving the experience of victims of domestic abuse, both children and adults. Reducing that re-traumatisation for adults in the actual space. And I noted the messages around special measures, and that's something that absolutely has come to us from victims around whether those special measures are suitably in place or not. I was talking to somebody recently who was describing to me having gone to the court, or getting a friend to go to the court in advance to check the special measures were in place because they hadn't been previously, and the kind of coordination, the extra processes they were having to go through to ensure that they felt safe were extraordinary and clearly, really concerning. And we also know, and it's not to be overly challenging of our colleagues, but we also know that sometimes for us as professionals, that courtroom isn't necessarily the most positive environment, and we want to work together to make sure it can be. These are difficult, contentious matters. I think we would be naive to say there's not going to be discomfort at least, and sometimes upset at worst, in terms of what's happening. But how we do that respectfully, thoughtfully, and how we actually deliver what we say we'll do is going to be really important. And many of those things will help us in the reduction of re-traumatisation of domestic abuse in the court environment itself. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the opportunity around Pathfinder for our staff is one that has been welcomed. I have to say, as somebody who's done a lot of change work over the years, I'm extraordinarily impressed by how positive the whole system is really receiving the new way of working, which is clearly, if I had to distill it, I would say a way in which we work with more children, we see them more and we see them sooner, and we come to a quicker outcome. Now, who wouldn't love that? But of course, there are some challenges with that too, in terms of how that is manageable for people in terms of their workload. But so many people saying so many consistent things. And of course, what's lovely about it in terms of really being able to manage change is that the family court advisors are saying very similar things to families where they're feeling a positive impact of that. So, going back to having one report, it feels so much better. I'd never go back to CAP. This is better for families. Whilst changes its challenges, I'm feeling optimistic and positive. I enjoy working with the children, all of those elements which are so important. Thank you. Next slide, please. As I've said, there are things that they want us to think about too, and some of those inefficiencies where we see continued delay. Some of that is about the wider system, some of that is about listing times, and some of that is about opportunities to get IDVA reports back in good time in order to be able to include their thoughts and assessments in the CIR, which is so important and so crucial. And we understand why those things can be delayed, but we've got to make sure that all of those inefficiencies are eradicated, so that the only reason we would delay is because it's absolutely in the child's best interest. Cadence and pace, I guess that's the kind of language we're using very much here at CAFCAS at the present time, because the requirement to turn around both the first stage, the information stage, and then the CIR within 40 days is a very fast turnaround. And that means there's only so many families people can be working with at each time. And where we've got families with many children, there's an opportunity for us to see all of those children, but that's still then a very difficult timeline to get that around. And sometimes some of our families are in different parts of the country than where the application starts, and we've got some real issues around how we can factor in some of those travel moments and time to see children in different environments with different people. And I note the feedback from the research that fathers felt less engaged with, fathers felt that they had less time. And we need to be thoughtful about that in terms of how we ensure that equity and that opportunity to really understand those children's lives with all of their carers. And then fidelity, absolutely a key word for Pathfinder. What we know and what we love about so much of humanity is that it has a great energy in being innovative. And we can have some innovation in this process, of course we can, and we can have some innovative working with our families and with our children and young people. But what we need to be very careful about is not to have too much innovation in the way in which we deliver this model, or we'll have many thousands of flowers bloom and some of them will be weeds. So we are keen to make sure that we stick with the fidelity of the model in order for us all to be confident that it's doing the right thing and that we're able to measure it in all the ways that we'd all understand. Thank you. Next slide. So we have a huge continued commitment to hearing children's voices. Those 140,000 children that I talk about, we want to be able to absolutely hear them in the moment, present them, amplify them, support them, sharing our recommendations with them, making sure that where our children's spoken wishes don't align with what we think is right for them, that we're able to spend time with those children to help them to understand why we have a different point of view. All of those things are incredibly important to us, and they're really well informed by our engagement with the Family Justice Young People's Board. Fantastic group of young people who really powerfully help shape the whole system's view and understanding of what matters to children. And so all of what we're doing, and they've got some great videos that they've done with us to support young people being able to engage with their FCAs in CAFCAS and to be think together about how do we help them to express their views. And we know it's not an easy thing. We know children understand the complexities of what's happening in their family. Sometimes, I dare to say, a little more than the grown-ups. And there is an element around how much concern children can have about upsetting one element or other, or worrying about having that kind of decision they feel based at their door. So helping them to understand those recommendations to the judges and the judges deciding. All of that is underpinned by our strategic plan and our feedback strategy, which is presently under review, and it will be a continuance of our 23-26 strategy because it's been working. We know it's getting us to a better place. We know from feedback from families and from our staff that our reworked domestic abuse policy is an improvement. We know from feedback from our families that we're more often hearing them, we're more often getting the processes right around them, especially where they've been victims, but we have more to do. We absolutely know we have more to do. It's a complex environment for people to be working in with very large numbers of children and their families. We're reviewing that private law reform internally, of course, and thinking about the feedback from that as we get more and more areas go live with Pathfinder. And at the same time, I can't say enough, making sure that the areas that are still delivering CAP have the opportunity to take all the learning that we're getting through this process into their work and into their practice. And so even practicing CAP will be vastly improved. And every child and every adult to have the opportunity to provide feedback. And we're thinking around that. But also our partners, we want to hear from you. We are not defensive. We know that there are differing views around CAFCAS. We've heard them in that research, and we want to hear them. We want to hear them every day in every way. And we want to work with you to think about how we as a system can make sure that we deliver those improved lives. My final slide now, I think. Yeah, thank you. So that's just the key learning and takeaways and the summary of everything we've said. So thank you. So from me, just a kind of summary then to say, as I've said at the beginning, we don't want children living their lives out in the family law courts. It's not where we want them to be. We want to be able to make the right representations, the right assessments, the right recommendations to judges to be able to support them in making the right decisions for children in a timely way and making sure that their carers along that journey are engaged with, that are supported where they're victims and doing the right thing to make sure children's lives improve. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you so much. That's really insightful, and again, so much to kind of take from that as well. So thank you very much, Teresa. And I know there's lots of questions coming in the Q&A, so we'll be able to kind of digest some of those in that. We've now got a very short video from Anna from CAFCAS Cymru, and I think Miranda is going to press play.
Miranda, good afternoon. It's a year since we completed the rollout of Pathfinder to the whole of Wales, and so this is very timely to be able to reflect on the experiences of children and young people and their families about how Pathfinder is working on elements that we still need to improve for them. So it's really positive to have confirmed by children and young people that they value having their voices heard in proceedings, and that parents and carers largely feel that this improves the proceedings and centres the proceedings on the voice of the child. We can see that not all children who took part in this study felt that their views were taken into account in the court's decision. And we have been working in Wales on children's participation beyond wishes and feelings. So making sure that they are told the outcome of proceedings and thinking about who shares that information with them, with guides prepared both for parents and carers who are going to share information, and also a toolkit that's been published for judges on writing to children. We've had some really excellent examples of letters from the judges to children to explain their reasoning, and this helps children understand that their views have been taken into account, even if the order may not actually be fully what the child has asked for. In terms of parents, it's really positive and encouraging that they can see a difference and improvement compared to CAP for parents who have been through both types of proceedings, and that the domestic abuse agency's involvement is positive in providing support and specialist risk assessments. That's another unique element of Pathfinder compared to CAP. However, we can see that not everyone in the study felt that their experience of domestic abuse had been fully understood and explored, and some felt that domestic abuse was downplayed, the outcome of proceedings they felt wasn't safe, or that they were left with unmanageable interactions with their other parent, with their child's other parent. So this does highlight, of course, the need to work in a safety first way and not make pro-contact assumptions across the system. And Cafcass Cymru, since this research has been undertaken, has published new domestic abuse guidance to support our practitioners to consistently approach the work with a domestic abuse and trauma-informed lens, ensure that we understand and assess risk of harm, and that we work in a transparent way with parents and families so they can understand our recommendations and how they contribute to the court's decisions. There is more to do. I would like to thank the researchers for this important report, and of course the families who contributed their valuable insights that will continue to shape and strengthen practice across Wales. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
Great. And for time purposes, I'm going to go straight into Alicia, who is the Family Justice Lead at the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England's office as well, who's I'm going to ask to stick to a tight 10-minute time frame as well, so that we can also do Q&A in that as well. Thanks, Alicia. Over to you.
No problem. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to attend on behalf of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales, Dame Nicole Jacobs. We are really delighted to see this evaluation, which really appraises the human experience of Pathfinder. And as we know, the human experience is the ultimate experience by which we measure the success of Pathfinder. The intention of Pathfinder was very much to mitigate the re-traumatisation of CAP and standard family court proceedings, and this has given us a really thorough and comprehensive insight into how that experience is developing and evolving through the development of Pathfinder. So it's really great to read and to be able to have this insight. So in terms of comments on behalf of the Domestic Abuse Commission, I'm going to sort of structure the way that I speak into three different parts. So first of all, I'll look at re-traumatisation and children, which will include maintaining focus on the child, and then I'll turn to the support operations. So the importance of domestic abuse services, the implementation of special measures, and sharing information with families. And this very much reflects the way that the evaluation report itself is structured. So I hope that aligns really well with everybody who's read the report. The empirical research in particular is very, very, very rich, and it's wonderful to be able to hear directly from children, because we know it is the voice of the child that should be centred within family court proceedings and should be at the heart of everything that we do, particularly with respect to domestic abuse. In terms of re-traumatisation and children, I think the evaluation report very much indicates that there is positive movement with understanding domestic abuse and minimising the re-traumatisation of distressing family law proceedings. We have one quote in the evaluation report which says that a judge saw straight through the abuse and held the perpetrator to account and was able to cut straight through the noise and focus on the child, which is exactly what we want to be hearing. This is the type of feedback that we want. Similarly, we have accounts of family court advisors being attentive and fair, really engaged, speaking with domestic abuse survivors in constructive, sensitive and tactful manner. And again, that's really brilliant feedback, and really positive to have that coming out of Pathfinder. And that's absolutely something that we want to keep hearing. In terms of some of the more negative references within the evaluation report, there are indications of downplaying and minimising domestic abuse. Now, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales is very strongly of the view that domestic abuse has to be understood properly in order to be engaged with effectively. So mothers indicating that they felt their cases had not been read in full is cause for concern, but also specific accounts of questioning about the validity of rape accounts. And also there is a single reference to a judge referring to losing a child if parents do not cooperate, which is wholly inappropriate and incredibly re-traumatising and distressing. So these are very much causes for concern. So if we frame them within the gold standard, the Commissioner very much wants to see judicial training throughout all tiers of the judiciary. And this is really premised on the fact that you have to understand domestic abuse in order to make a court order which benefits the child and which is in the best interest of the child. Now, this is always rendered a little bit more difficult in coercively controlling behaviours cases, because it can be very difficult to identify, and we know that perpetrators can be very calm, collected, persuasive and charming. And we also know that the family court can be utilised as an arena of ongoing abuse, litigation abuse, or as Justice Leven has referred to it as warfare, legal warfare. So the trauma-informed approach to Pathfinder has to be the bedrock from which all else flows. And the minimisation of abuse is one which is concerning and which is not really in the original construct and design of Pathfinder. So that is certainly cause for concern. In terms of accounts of domestic abuse not being referenced in child impact reports, again, that is something which needs to be looked at. And also the artificial separation of protective parent and child. Now, we know that Section 3 of the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 now recognises children as victims of domestic abuse in their own right, whether they see, hear or experience the effects of domestic abuse. There is an anecdote within the evaluation whereby a child witnessed domestic abuse, but the judge downplayed the effects of that. We don't have judicial steer on Section 3, but that is something which ought to be maximised in order to, in parallel, maximise the protection of the child. Now, this brings me on quite neatly, and I'm very conscious of staying to time, of maintaining the focus on the child. The Pathfinder model is premised on centering the child and hearing their voice at the outset. And this is really important for centering the child within family court proceedings, because they are the reason for the proceedings, but also because the judicial approach is it's far easier to understand the dynamic by having the child's voice up front and centre. Now, this does require a lot of front-loading, which needs to be properly resourced, but it does mean that when cases go into Pathfinder, there is a more comprehensive picture of the family and the dynamics. We see children referring to letters after proceedings and finding those really helpful, and those mechanisms really add value to the Pathfinder model. And all of this, of course, is couched within Article 9 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1989, which explicitly says children need to be involved in proceedings which relate to them. Now, if we connect children and re-traumatisation to the separate analysis, which is undertaken in the evaluation report about improving the understanding of the harms of alienating behaviours and managing cross-allegations, as the report says, it is the Family Justice Council's December 2025 guidance on, I beg your pardon, 2024 guidance on alienating behaviours, which needs to be the process by which these cases are allocated and which are addressed. Now, that gatekeeping needs to be really robust, and that guidance needs to be applied because of the re-traumatisation and the ability those allegations have to distract and to distort and to complicate unnecessarily allegations of domestic abuse. Again, this ties in with the Commissioner's call for really comprehensive abuse-informed and trauma-centric training throughout the family court for all family court actors, and at this extends to and includes allegations of alienating behaviours. A point which is quite pertinent within the evaluation is that there are reports of there being confusion of parental conflict and domestic abuse. And again, domestic abuse training is really the way to address the miscategorisation of behaviours. So moving now to the operations and the support, I'd like to speak about the importance of domestic abuse services, the implementation of special measures, and sharing information about the process with families. So the report references all three of these really, really comprehensively. So I will only touch on those to align with the Commissioner's gold standard. In terms of the importance of domestic abuse service, we know these are vital. We know these are a lifeline. We know these make an absolute difference to the way that family court proceedings are experienced. Unfortunately, it seems to boil down to resource. The evaluation refers to some survivors of domestic abuse who, due to capacity issues, limited resources, high staff turnover, meant that they went into court without in-person support. Comparatively, we can also see accounts of survivors who went into the family court and did have that support, and how much it meant to them having somebody literally holding their hand under a table, providing advice, being a listening ear, and being a pillar of support for them. So the resource issue, which underpins the domestic abuse service delivery, is one which has to be looked at as a matter of priority. There's also really positive accounts of domestic abuse services, including therapy for children, which protective parents found to be very useful and helpful. In terms of special measures, we can see that they are more readily available in Pathfinder, which is really positive. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner's October 2025 publication, Everyday Business, sets out research from the Family Court Reporting and Review Mechanism, which is a research project like no other, where our in-house researchers were installed in 3 different family court sites and where they observed proceedings for 3 weeks. And they also did a full case file analysis of 300 cases. And when I say full case file analysis, I mean the entire bundle. Now, the data which has come out of this pilot is really quite stark and indicates the prevalence of domestic abuse in the family court. So domestic abuse was observed in 73% of cases and 87% of files, but was only considered a live issue in 42% of cases, there is a really stark difference there. And the argument is, well, are special measures really that special at all if the prevalence of domestic abuse is that high? So the measures are being more available in Pathfinder, but we also have some domestic abuse survivors saying that they weren't offered those special measures, and others were questioned as to why they wanted them. And that again comes back to the re-traumatisation and the disbelief and downplaying of domestic abuse, which again is cause for concern. A positive thematic that's coming out of the evaluation report is sharing information and how this is a source of comfort and support for families. The family court is complex, it can be really lengthy, it can be very distressing and overwhelming. And one of the quotes from the evaluation report was, when judicial decision-making processes are not clearly explained, families may have found it difficult to understand how and why certain decisions are made. Now, the Pathfinder model seeks to address this by having a case progression officer there at the outset and better communication with parties to proceedings, and that can only be a positive thing. So finally, I'd like to conclude by drawing all of that together and reflecting on the balance of the evaluation. The Commissioner is very strongly of the view that the Pathfinder model is intended to be efficient, but we cannot lose sight of what efficient means within domestic abuse. Efficient within the context of domestic abuse means effectively engaging with domestic abuse, properly engaging with domestic abuse, and understanding the impacts of domestic abuse on both adult and child survivor. We know that Pathfinder is more efficient than the present CAP model, but the term efficient cannot be diluted to mean that we dispose of cases very quickly, yet poorly. And again, this will tie in with reconsideration for wider structural issues. We know 30% of family court cases are returns to the family court, and the review stage may well be a way to mitigate that and should be considered within the context of wider efficiency arguments. And that will be all from me, so I hope I've kept to time, Vicky.
You've done a marvellous job and managed to also have a really kind of rich discussion and insight from the office. And for anybody who hasn't read Everyday Business, I really would recommend that you, and we can, I think, pin it here or send it out to people afterwards as well. It's a fairly grim read, but it's incredibly important and gives such a rich and in-depth insight into the family courts and kind of what's going on there. So really thankful for that contribution from you there, Alicia, as well. We've got a really short amount of time for some Q&A, and I can see that colleagues are other colleagues. So, for example, there's a question around how the domestic abuse is kind of assessed and understood, and what ideas around those rare instances of things like counter or kind of false allegations, all of that kind of stuff. And I can see that others have answered that in the chat around that process. And again, would encourage you to read the process evaluation as well, which goes into a bit more detail around how that works as well. I've grouped a couple of the questions together that are specifically about the research. So there was a question around grandparents and non-parents, and recognising that was only one within your study, but if there are any other insights from non-parents that are involved in the Pathfinder process. There's also around that if anything came from the research around specific support needs for children, and also around litigants in person, and questioning were all of the participants representing themselves, or had any of them had legal support, and did that change anything? So it feels like that's for you, Charlotte, Claire and Helen, so I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I can address those as best as I can, and Helen and Claire, feel free to come in. Yeah, so in terms of the grandparent, so of the grandparent that we spoke with did find the process quite challenging and isolating, and didn't get the outcome that they wanted. So that there was certainly challenges there. Obviously, that's not reflective of all experience of sort of non-parents that go through the process. And I do think that it'd be useful to gather more information and do more research with that particular group, but that was the sort of experience of the grandparent that we spoke with. And in terms of support needs for children question, we certainly saw that there was the need for support for children where domestic abuse was in the family, and specific needs that children have in relation to that was flagged as being particularly important, and sort of making sure that there is that tailored support there. Similarly, it's an incredibly challenging process, as we've heard extensively from other colleagues who presented on the call, and the need for sort of mental health support in relation to that, which wasn't always available. We know that in relation to CAMS, but that was a support need there. And one thing that was also flagged was around children that might have additional needs. So some of the parents that we spoke with where their children did have additional needs felt that CAFCAS often accommodated this. So thinking about how children were engaged with, for instance, and the different ways that could be done was seen as a sort of a welcome addition to the Pathfinder process. In terms of litigants in person, the question there, I'm going to see if Helen and Claire have anything to add on any of this, but I'll give my brief summary on each of them. There was a mix of participants that were represented by solicitors, and others that were litigants in person. So those that did have solicitors had more positive experiences than those who were litigants in person, who had largely negative experiences. And they in particular described sort of feeling dismissed or not listened to, and in particular that was identified for victim survivors in particular. So there was some challenges there, but we did manage to speak with people that had the sort of different types of representation there. I don't know whether Helen or Claire have anything further to add to what I've just said, or have I kind of summarised okay there?
I think you've summarised it pretty well, Charlotte. I think the only thing I'd add is really on the support needs for children. Something that came up a lot was kind of the role that schools or school counsellors can play in that, particularly if, CAFCAS or social workers are coming to the school to meet the child, just being aware of what's going on, being available to offer support, having kind of a safe space for the child to go afterwards, that kind of thing.
Thank you. One thing that struck me, and we'll have to finish in a minute, so if we've not got round to answering any of these, I think there's one around like a number of cases that don't get, or how many cases do get to a final hearing, and I suppose it speaks a little bit to what Alicia was talking about in terms of some of the efficiencies and the gatekeeping element that happens. So we can share some of that data. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but we can share some of that around to people as well. But just I suppose a final reflection was, I suppose it was a small part of it, but I was quite interested that the case progression officer didn't come through in the research when you were speaking, considering that's such a pivotal new element within the Pathfinder course as well. And I mean, you've got literally a couple of minutes, but were there any reflections is that just because people, you think, I mean, felt like that they did understand the process and so they didn't realise that it wasn't something that was there before, or does it say something more widely around the role? Helen, you were nodding enthusiastically, so I wonder
if it's just about sort of people's understanding of who everybody is, and you're just a court person, so they may just have had good communication from the court, from HMCTS, and they didn't necessarily know it was that person in that role. But that's our best sort of assumption from what we got back. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Alicia, Teresa, before we end, is there anything else that you want to add before we kind of let everyone get back to their afternoons?
No, just thank you. It's really helpful to have the conversation always, and I think the questions are absolutely focused in all the right places. There's some interesting queries there around, the important debates that I think we need to continue to have about pace and timescales and why not, and what is that feedback we've heard from survivors, which has led us to that position. So I think there's some really good debate in the question and answers, which are good for taking forward.
Thank you. I was struck by your presentation around that idea of pace and different timelines, so the courts and the parents as well, and where there might be tension between some of those. I thought that was really insightful, and that Pathfinder isn't a panacea as well, I think is a good point, well made. Alicia, any final thoughts from you?
No, thank you very much for having me. I think the evaluation report is just so rich and insightful, and actually we just need more of that. We just need to keep hearing more about the experience from parties to proceedings and children. So it's really valuable to have this report and to be able to reflect on it and take it into account.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you to the three of you and the rest of the team as well for undertaking that research. And thank you, Alicia, Teresa, and to Anna, who obviously contributed via video as well, for your helpful insights and thoughts on that as well. Thank you very much for all of you who have joined us too. Recordings will be available on YouTube, and have a lovely rest of your days.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye.